Welcomedo, boring past times, for sleep tonight. We drift through quiet centuries and listen to the hands that shaped the world in ways too slow to notice. This is not the history of battles or kings, but of patience, of people who worked by firelight, who waited for clay to dry, who painted stories in colors that never faded. Our story begins in the damp air of 17th-century Delft, a small city of canals and kilns, where potters turned river clay into something almost like porcelain, but not quite. They called it Delftware blue and white, calm and steady as the northern sea dot. It was made not for glory, but for the comfort of a table, the quiet of a home, and the satisfaction of work done carefully over time. So settle in. Let the sound of water and the glow of the kiln carry you back to the slow world of the Delft potters, where the earth met fire and imitation became its own kind of beauty. This is how Delft potters turned clay into the blue of distant seas. You might imagine that history moves quickly, that it happens in loud moments of conquest, or sudden discoveries, or proclamations shouted across palace courtyards. But in the royal city of Benin, long before the arrival of the Europeans who would later plunder its treasures, history moved more quietly. It moved through molten bronze, the slow drip of wax, and the careful breath of artisans working by candlelight in workshops that never fully slept. The story of Benin's bronze casters begins not with kings, but with a courtyard. It was not a grand place, nor meant for ceremony. It was where men and boys knelt in the reddish earth, shaping small pieces of beeswax into heads, plaques, and figures that would one day line the palace walls. The air smelled faintly of clay, metal, and smoke, a scent that over the centuries became inseparable from Benin itself. The Egon Iranwan, the Guild of Royal Casters, was one of the oldest hereditary guilds in West Africa. Membership was passed from father to son, as unchanging as the rhythm of the drum that signaled the beginning of work each morning. Each family had its own small forge, its own tools, and its own understanding of how to coax stories out of metal. The work was done slowly, carefully, and always with the understanding that bronze was not merely decoration. It was memory made visible in the Benin Kingdom, which reached its height between the 13th and 17th centuries. The past was not something you read or wrote. It was something you looked at. The plaques and heads that filled the Abba's king's palace were records, scenes of tribute, of royal processions, of leopards and coral-beaded courtiers frozen forever in metal. Each surface carried details so fine you could trace them with your fingertip: the folds of fabric, the curve of a tusk, the quiet dignity of a king's eyes. But before the gleam of the finished bronze came the long, uneventful hours of repetition. Each day began in the same way. Apprentices gathered the raw materials: beeswax softened over small fires, palm fibers twisted into cords, clay collected from the earth beyond the city's moat. They worked in silence, except for the faint, rhythmic sound of tools scraping. It was slow work, and often unappreciated. Yet within that monotony lay something profound, a deep patience born from generations, who knew that perfection could only come from stillness. When you picture the making of bronze, you might think of smelting, of roaring furnaces and molten metal pouring like light. But the Benin process, the lost wax casting method, was quieter, more meditative. First came the wax model, soft, pliable, and detailed. The artist would build up the figure little by little, carving minute patterns that would vanish forever once cast. Around it, layers of fine clay were applied. When the mold was heated, the wax melted out through small vents, literally lost, leaving behind an empty space into which molten bronze would later be poured. It was a process of disappearance and remembrance. Each work began with something fragile, a shape of wax, too delicate to last, and ended with something eternal. Perhaps that's why the guild members often spoke of the wax as if it were alive. It remembers what we touch, one old caster once said, according to oral tradition. It listens to the story we tell it. Then it hides that story inside the bronze. By candlelight, these men worked with a focus that bordered on the sacred. The flickering flames distorted the wax forms, making them seem to move. Apprentices whispered stories about how the spirits of the ancestors sometimes guided a caster's hands. The guild, after all, claimed descent from Igage, the legendary master craftsman who had once been summoned from Ife to serve the Abba of Benin. He was said to have arrived with nothing but his tools, his knowledge of bronze, and a quiet sense of purpose that would shape Benin's royal art for centuries. The guild's relationship with the Abba was both intimate and formal. Their duty was to record, not in ink or parchment, but in bronze. Each plaque was a royal commission, paid for in coral beads, cloth, or cowries, and each carried meaning beyond what it showed. A king standing between two attendants was not simply a portrait. It was a declaration of cosmic order. The Oba was the center of the world, the sun around which the kingdom revolved. As evening descended over Benin City, the sound of hammers would soften. The fires dimmed, and only a few flames remained, trembling in the humid air. The day's work was not glamorous. It was repetitive. A misstep could ruin days of preparation. And yet, that repetition formed the rhythm of royal history itself. The plaques and heads created in those small workshops were, in time, what would define the kingdom in the eyes of the world. The apprentices, their hands streaked with red earth, often did not live to see their work celebrated. Many never left the courtyard. Their contribution was invisible, the shaping of wax that would melt and vanish before the final casting. But without them, the finished bronzes could not exist. In this way, the guild reflected the structure of the kingdom itself, a network of unseen labor supporting the visible glory of the Abadat. In the evenings, as candles burned low, older casters told stories. They spoke of the days when the Abba's palace had been freshly built, with its vast courtyards and high pointed roofs covered in corrugated palm leaves. They described processions filled with drummers, leopards, and dancers, moments that would soon be fixed in bronze, to be remembered long after the dust of the parade had settled. Sometimes, a young apprentice would ask a question that revealed the quiet mystery at the heart of their craft. Why must we make the same faces again and again? The older men would pause before answering. The repetition was part of the ritual. Each Oba was both new and old, a link in an unbroken chain. By sculpting similar faces, they affirmed the continuity of the royal line. Every new bronze was a reassurance that the world still held its order. Change was dangerous. Tradition, steady and slow, was safe. Beyond the palace walls, the world was changing. The Portuguese had begun to arrive along the West African coast by the late 15th century. They came first as traders, seeking ivory, pepper, and later, people. The Aba welcomed them cautiously, trading art for goods, ideas, and most notably, brass manillas, the bracelets that would become the very material of the bronzes themselves. The metal that told Benin's royal stories had often traveled from Europe in the form of currency used for trade. The irony of history is that some of the same brass that once purchased captives would later become the shining faces of kings and warriors, cast by the hands of free Benin artisans. But for now, in this first moment of our story, the world outside was still distant. Within the guild courtyard, the pace of life remained unchanged. The clay molds were stacked near the hearth, and the smell of burning palm oil filled the air. Tomorrow, they would fire the molds, melt the bronze, and pour it in one careful, silent movement, a moment of heat and transformation that lasted only a few breaths. Then, more waiting, more silence. It could take weeks before the final piece was ready to be shown. The surface would be polished slowly with sand and oil until it gleamed like water. Every line and figure, every detail of coral beads or ceremonial swords would stand out clearly. The Aba's historian priests would later interpret these details, reciting the events they depicted in rhythmic chants that echoed across the courtyards. In that way, each bronze was a sentence in a long, unending royal story, one that would continue as long as the fires of the guild were lit. Under the dim light of candles and stars, the bronze casters of Benin worked not just with metal, but with memory. They did not speak of time as something lost or gained, but as something folded into the objects they made. Every casting preserved a moment, a gesture, a truth about the kingdom. Long after the wax melted and the molds broke apart, the memory remained. It is difficult now, centuries later, to imagine the quiet persistence of that courtyard, the rhythm of hands shaping stories for a king, the long wait as molten bronze cooled, the patience that carried through generations. And yet, perhaps that patience is what allowed their work to endure so powerfully, even after the palace fell, even after the bronzes were stolen, scattered, and displayed behind glass, far from home. For the bronze does not forget it, waits even now for those who still listen. If you follow the scent of salt and cardamom along the western coast of India, past the fishing villages and the narrow alleys where monsoon winds twist through the drying nets, you might come to a sound. It is not loud. It is the soft clack-clack of wooden looms, the slow rhythm of hands weaving cotton thread into something that would change the world, quietly and completely. Before spices and ships became the symbols of empire, there was cloth. Cotton cloth, light, soft, breathable, and unassuming, became one of the most powerful materials in human history, and its story, though it stretches across oceans, begins in small, dimly lit rooms where people worked in silence in ancient India. The art of spinning and weaving cotton was already old when the pyramids of Egypt were young. Archaeologists have found fragments of cotton fabric in the Indus Valley dating back to around 2500 BCE. These early weavers, working with drop spindles and hand looms, learned how to twist the short fibers of the cotton plant into strong, fine threads. Over centuries, this became a kind of quiet genius, a mastery of patience and precision that few outsiders understood. By the medieval period, especially between the 13th and 17th centuries, Indian cotton had become the envy of the world. It was traded across Asia, Africa, and eventually Europe. Long before the British built their empire, Indian cotton sailed the seas in dhows and junks, folded carefully in bales, smelling faintly of oil and smoke. From the ports of Gujarat, the Coromandel coast, and Bengal, cloth traveled as far as Cairo, Muscat, Venice, and later London. Yet for all its vast reach, the craft itself remained humble. A typical weaving household might have looked something like this: a low thatched house near a well, its walls darkened by oil lamps. In one corner, a woman sits cross-legged, spinning cotton with a small wheel, the charkha, whose rhythmic hum became as familiar as breathing. Her husband works the loom, his feet pressing the treadles, his hands guiding the shuttle back and forth. The air is filled with floating lint that catches the sunlight. Outside, drying lengths of cloth hang between palm trees like pale sails. Cotton weaving was not glamorous. It required endless repetition and attention to detail. But it was also an act of quiet control over nature. The cotton plant, delicate and temperamental, grew only in certain soils and climates. The spinners learned to feel the quality of each fiber between their fingers. Too dry, and it would snap. Too moist, and it would clump. They didn't need to measure. They simply knew. From these ordinary hands came extraordinary cloth, muslin, so fine it was said to pass through a ring, calico, strong and washable, and chintz, brightly printed with floral designs that Europeans would one day copy endlessly. Each type had its own rhythm, its own purpose, and each piece of cloth was the product of quiet, unhurried work, the kind of labor that builds empires without meaning to. When the monsoon rains arrived, the weavers worked by lamplight. They wrapped their looms in cloth to protect them from humidity. The smell of wet earth filled the air. Each sound, the treadle, the shuttle, the dripping rain, became part of the same endless pattern. Children would fall asleep to that rhythm, the song of the loom blending with the sound of thunder. And all the while, the cloth made in these small homes was on its way to reshape global trade. By the 15th century, Indian cotton had already become the most desired textile in the Islamic world. Merchants from the Persian Gulf and East Africa flocked to the ports of Cobalt and Masulipatam to buy it. They prized the fabric not only for its beauty but for its practicality. It was light, durable, and easy to dye. While silk was luxurious and wool heavy, cotton suited every climate and class. It could be simple or splendid. Kings wore it, but so did sailors and servants. In this quiet universality lay its power. When the Portuguese first reached India by sea in 1498, following Vasco da Gama's long voyage around Africa, they found not a land of spices waiting to be discovered, but a continent already humming with trade. The markets of Calicut overflowed with cloth, white cotton, dyed cotton, painted cotton. To the Portuguese, it was astonishing. They had never seen textile production on such a scale, nor such quality. Back in Europe, wool still ruled. Cotton was rare and rough, spun from short fibers imported from the eastern Mediterranean. But Indian cotton was soft, fine, and colorful. It seemed almost impossible. And so, as they did with spices and gold, the Europeans sought to control it. They bought bales of cotton cloth to sell in Africa, where it became currency in the growing trade for enslaved people. They carried it to the Americas, where it was exchanged for silver, sugar, and tobacco. Slowly, the threads spun in the monsoon villages began to connect continents. Meanwhile, in the weaving houses, life continued as before. Empires might rise and fall outside, but the work of turning cotton into cloth never changed. Each thread was still hand-spun, each warp and weft still aligned by touch, not sight. The weavers had little reason to know that their ordinary work had become the economic backbone of global exchange. There were regions that became legendary for their cloth. Dhaka in Bengal produced muslin, so fine that European traders gave it poetic names: woven air, morning dew. The Mughal emperors prized it. Their courtiers wore robes made of it that seemed to float. Meanwhile, Gujarat's calico found its way into African trade networks, its patterns imitated in European printing houses. The chintzes of the Coromandel coast, painted with natural dyes that held fast against washing, transformed European fashion. By the 17th century, ships of the Dutch East India Company, the English East India Company, and others began to carry Indian cotton on a scale the world had never seen. The fabric reached London, Amsterdam, and Lisbon, where it caused a quiet revolution. European consumers adored it. It was comfortable, washable, and cheap. For the first time, ordinary people could afford colorful, patterned clothing. But for European wool and silk producers, this was a problem. Cotton from India was too good, too plentiful, too fine, too beautiful. Laws were passed to restrict its import. In France and England, calico bans forbade people from wearing Indian cloth, but bans cannot stop comfort. People wore it anyway. While governments debated, Indian weavers continued their quiet routines, unaware, perhaps, that their work was provoking entire industries to panic across the sea. Each region of India had its own traditions, each shaped by climate and history. In Gujarat, dry heat favored thick, durable cloth. In Bengal, humidity allowed the finest threads. On the Coromandel coast, dyeing was an art form in itself. Families guarded dye recipes as jealously as any merchant guarded his gold. Indigo, madder, turmeric, and pomegranate rind were mixed in vats that had been used for generations. Dyers tested color by dipping threads and watching how they caught the light in the sun. To them, it was not chemistry. It was instinct, and always the work continued at the same pace. No factory whistles, no overseers, no rush. Just the slow, steady rhythm of looms, the patience of hands, and the understanding that beauty takes time. The miracle, if one can call it that, was how these countless small acts of quiet labor wove together to form one of the first truly global industries. By the time the Industrial Revolution began in Britain, much of the machinery invented there, the spinning jenny, the water frame, the power loom, was designed to imitate what Indian weavers already did by hand. The industrial age began, in part, as an attempt to mechanize the rhythm of the monsoon coast. But that comes later in our story. For now, imagine standing outside a weaver's hut at dusk. The rain has stopped, and the air smells of wet leaves and wood smoke. Inside, the lamp burns low. The shuttle still moves. Each sound, the creak of wood, the whisper of thread, is a heartbeat of history. Empires will rise because of this cloth. Wars will be fought over it. Machines will be built to replace it. But tonight, in this small room, it is only fabric and patience to things that have always outlasted kings. The cloth that will cover half the world is still being woven in silence, and no one yet knows how costly that silence will become. For now, though, the kingdom still glowed. The Abba's court still danced in coral and white. The forges still burned, and the bronze still remembered. But beyond the horizon, sails were gathering again, this time with less patience and far less respect. There is a kind of silence that comes before disaster. Not a peaceful silence, but a heavy one, the kind that presses against the walls, as if the air itself knows what's about to happen. By the late 19th century, the silence around Benin City had thickened. The forges of the Egon Iranwan still glowed each night, their flames steady and stubborn. Wax was still molded, clay was still packed around delicate shapes, and bronze still flowed like liquid memory into the molds. But outside the palace walls, the world had changed in ways no guild could melt down or reshape. The Europeans who had once come with gifts and manillas now came with contracts, gunboats, and a new word, protectorate. In 1892, a British delegation presented the Abba of Benin Ovenramwan Nagbiasi with a treaty. On its surface, it promised friendship, but its clauses, written in English legalese and translated unevenly, essentially handed the kingdom's sovereignty to the British Empire. The Oba, cautious and proud, hesitated. For centuries, Benin had controlled trade on its own terms. The city had never been conquered. It had endured the centuries of shifting European powers, Portuguese, Dutch, French, English, by moving carefully, slowly, deliberately. But now, the tempo of history was speeding up. The British wanted immediate access to Benin's markets, palm oil, and trade routes. They were not interested in the Abba's rituals, nor in his bronzes, nor in the slow rhythm of the city. When the Abba delayed, Britain grew impatient. Plans were set in motion, plans drawn in distant offices with pens and maps, not in guild courtyards with fire and wax. In January 1897, a punitive expedition was organized. Officially, it was framed as a response to the killing of a British delegation that had entered Benin during a sacred festival against the Abba's explicit warnings. Unofficially, it was a calculated move to seize the city, its wealth, and its resources. Thousands of soldiers, armed with Maxim guns and artillery, advanced on a city whose defenses were built for a different kind of war. Meanwhile, within the bronze caster's courtyard, nothing changed at first. The apprentices still rolled their wax, their hands stained with clay. The masters still polished finished plaques with quiet, circular motions. But they must have sensed the shift in the air, the distant rumble of forces too large to stop with ritual or patience. The Abba's palace had always been the heart of the kingdom, a vast network of courtyards, shrines, galleries, and columns, all painted in the soft red of Benin's earth. Bronze heads of former Abbas stared calmly into the courtyard from their altars. Each plaque told a story of royal power, diplomacy, or ceremony. The palace itself was a physical archive, a place where power and history were inseparable. That was exactly why the British targeted it. The expedition reached Benin in February, 1897, in a matter of days. The city that had stood for centuries was overtaken. The fighting was brief, brutal, and uneven. The British soldiers carried modern weapons. The Benin warriors carried muskets, spears, and shields. The Aba's guards fought fiercely, but they were outmatched. Fires spread quickly through the palace complex, consuming wooden columns and palm-thatched dot in the forges. Where artisans had once whispered to their molds, the flames roared out of control. Clay cracked in the heat. Wax melted in an instant. Molds collapsed before they could be used. Bronze works that had taken weeks, even months, to prepare vanished in a single night of heat and smoke. The British soldiers entered the palace, grounds with orders to loot and burn. What they found stunned even them. Walls lined with hundreds of bronze plaques and carved ivory tusks. Altars to the royal ancestors, covered with cast heads and intricate figures. Coral-beaded regalia stacked in rooms. Centuries of quiet, deliberate memory lay before them, and so they took it. Some soldiers pried plaques from the palace walls with bayonets. Others stacked ivory tusks in wagons. Bronze heads, some weighing more than a man could easily lift, were carried out through the smoking ruins. Altars were dismantled. Everything was catalogued, shipped to the coast, and sent to London as war booty. A few officers sent pieces home to their families as souvenirs. The oboe was captured and later exiled to Calabar, far from the city that had once revolved around him like a sun. He would never return. Benin itself was burned to the ground, but bronze, unlike wax or wood, does not burn. Among the charred remains, many bronzes survived. They were thrown into piles, packed into crates, and dispersed to museums and private collections across Europe and America. The British Museum received hundreds. Others went to Germany, France, and the United States. What had once been sacred royal memory was now displayed behind glass, labeled in foreign languages. For the Egon Iranwan, the trauma was twofold. Their city was gone. Their king was gone. And their work, the slow, careful work of generations, was scattered like dust on the wind. Yet even in the ruins, the guild survived. Artisans who escaped the fires regrouped quietly in the following years. Some of their tools were hidden before the invasion, buried in courtyards, tucked beneath altars. A few molds were saved, their surfaces scorched but intact. They returned to what they had always done, shaping wax, molding clay, melting bronze. But now, their work carried a new layer of meaning. For centuries, the bronzes had told stories for the palace of royal order, processions, foreign visitors, rituals, and victories. After 1897, the same art became a quiet act of resistance. Casting bronze was a way to say, "We are still here. Even if the palace walls are gone, the hands that made them are not." Time passed. The British declared Benin part of their colony. The Aba's authority was reduced, but not entirely erased. His descendants remained symbolic figures, allowed to maintain rituals as long as they did not challenge the colonial administration. Within this narrow space, the guild continued its work, slowly, patiently. If you imagine a night in Benin around 1905, it would look both familiar and changed. A few lanterns burning low, apprentices leaning over wax figures. But the silence would be heavier now. not the comfortable quiet of tradition, but the quiet of people remembering what had been taken. What makes this part of history striking is its lack of spectacle. There were no grand uprisings by the guild, no dramatic rebellions, just steady, stubborn craft. The same hands that once served kings now preserved memory for the people themselves. Bronze heads continued to be cast, sometimes with subtle differences, slight shifts in symbolism, quiet nods to loss and survival. And meanwhile, across the sea, their stolen works became famous. European scholars described them with a mixture of awe and condescension, amazed that such sophisticated art could come from Africa. The irony, of course, was that these pieces had existed for centuries, unseen by the world beyond Benin, because they were never meant to leave. They were not made to astonish outsiders. They were made to hold memory still. Museums displayed them as curiosities, but to the people of Benin, they were fragments of a broken archive. The guild elders who survived the burning of the city passed on their craft in whispers. Apprentices learned not just the technique of lost wax casting, but the weight of its history. A wax figure can melt in seconds, but bronze, once cast, endures for centuries. And so, even as colonial rule settled like dust over the kingdom, the guild held on to its slow rhythm. Soft wax, dry clay, hot bronze, cool silence. By the mid-20th century, as Nigeria approached independence, the bronzes began to return to the edges of conversation. Scholars and activists spoke of cultural restitution. The descendants of the Obas, though long stripped of real power, continued to host ceremonies. The Igyan Street in modern Benin City became both a place of memory and of quiet production. The same families who had worked for centuries still lived there. Their fires never truly went out. Today, many of the bronzes remain scattered across the world, but their story is not static. Debates over restitution and repatriation grow louder each year. Some pieces have been returned. Others wait silently behind glass. What's remarkable is not only that the bronzes survived conquest, fire, and displacement, but that the guild, the quiet, patient hands that made them, still exists. In a world that moves faster than ever, their craft remains slow. A young apprentice today still learns the same steps an apprentice did 500 years ago. He still softens wax over a small fire. He still shapes it with care. He still waits, listening to the silence of metal, remembering it's easy to focus on the moment of the British invasion, the loud moment, the fire and the theft. But perhaps the true story is what came before and after, the long centuries of work by candlelight, and the quiet refusal to let that memory be erased. The bronzes remember the kings, yes, but they also remember the hands that shaped them. And those hands, against all odds, never stopped moving. Reflection. The fire of 1897 tried to erase memory, but bronze does not burn. The artisans of Benin may have lost their palace, their king, and their archives, but through their patient craft, they carried history forward into a new world. Their story is a reminder that memory does not always shout. Sometimes it endures in silence. When the first cotton mill began turning in the damp air of Lancashire, few in England could have imagined that the steady hum of its machines would echo all the way to India. But history has a way of changing quietly at first. The Industrial Revolution. that great storm of spinning wheels and pistons, began not with thunder but with a soft sound, familiar to weavers half a world away, the whir of thread. By the late 18th century, Europe's fascination with Indian cotton had turned into dependence. English merchants had grown rich selling fine muslins, calicoes, and chintzes imported from the Indian coasts. But the British East India Company, which controlled much of this trade, faced a dilemma. Indian cloth was cheap and beautiful, too cheap and too beautiful. Local weavers in England could not compete. So, instead of relying forever on Indian imports, Britain sought a solution that would bring cotton's magic under its own control. That solution was machinery in the small workshops of northern England. Inventors began tinkering with wooden frames, spindles, and gears. In 1764, James Hargreaves created the spinning jenny, which allowed one person to spin multiple threads at once. Soon came Richard Arkwright's water frame, Samuel Crompton's mule, and Edmund Cartwright's power loom. Each new device did not just save time. It took a piece of the weaver's craft and turned it into something mechanical, something that no longer depended on the rhythm of human hands. In India, the change came slowly at first, like a tide turning miles away. The looms of Bengal still clacked softly in the humid evenings. The charkas still spun. But the ships that once came to buy these cloths began returning with something new: cotton yarn spun in Manchester. It was coarse, uneven, and far less lovely than what the Indian spinners made, but it was cheap. And that, in the end, was what mattered most. British traders, now masters of India's ports and territories, began exporting raw cotton from India to feed their mills, then importing back machine-woven cloth to sell in the same markets. It was a perfect, if cruel, circle. The same hands that once made the world's finest textiles now picked the cotton that fed the machines that replaced them. In towns like Dhaka, once famous for muslin so fine it was called woven air, the looms fell silent. Travelers who visited Bengal in the early 19th century wrote of deserted weaving villages and abandoned dye pits. Some exaggerated, perhaps, but the pattern was real. When cloth that had taken days to weave could now be made by a machine in hours, the slow art of hand weaving lost its buyers. And yet, even as the industry collapsed, the work did not disappear entirely. In many villages, people continued weaving simply because it was what they had always done. The threads still spun, even when they earned almost nothing. You might imagine one of those weavers now, sitting cross-legged before his loom, in the flickering glow of a mustard oil lamp. He hears rumors of machines in England that can do the same work faster. But such stories feel unreal, as distant as the sound of the sea to someone living inland. What he knows is the feel of the shuttle in his hand, the tension in the thread, the sound of the loom's wooden heartbeat. He keeps weaving. Meanwhile, in Manchester, those same sounds are being recreated on a vast scale. The click of thousands of looms in cavernous brick mills, driven not by hand but by steam. The air is thick with cotton, lint, and soot. The workers are not artisans but factory laborers, men, women, and even children who tend to machines rather than craft. They work 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week, in air so dense it tastes of metal. An abundance, more than beauty, reshapes the world. By the early 19th century, British cotton goods had flooded the global market. Calico from Manchester and Glasgow began replacing the handmade cloth of Bengal, Surat, and Madras. The same patterns were copied: floral designs, block prints, stripes, but now they were printed with chemical dyes on machine-woven cloth. The irony was quiet but sharp. The very style of Indian fabric that Europe had once adored became the model for Europe's own industrial production. The Calico Acts, which had once banned Indian imports, were repealed. The imitators no longer feared the original, because the original had been crushed in India. The consequences unfolded slowly and painfully. Millions who had once lived by spinning or weaving turned to other forms of labor, often agricultural, sometimes servile. The British colonial administration promoted cotton as a raw export crop. The fields of Maharashtra, Gujarat, and the Deccan filled with cotton plants, meant not for Indian looms, but for British mills. The empire, like the cloth itself, had been rewoven into a new pattern, one where India supplied the raw fiber, and Britain the finished fabric. Even the tools of the weavers began to vanish. Wooden looms were dismantled, their parts sold for firewood. The charkha, once the symbol of quiet domestic industry, became a relic. In some regions, families burned looms in resignation, their trade gone, their skills suddenly worthless. But still, not everyone gave up. In remote villages and small towns, weavers adapted. Some began making coarser cloth for local markets, practical, plain, used for bedding or wrapping. Others turned to specialized crafts that machines could not easily copy: intricate embroidery, fine dye work, or silk blends. And through all of it, the tradition of textile making, though diminished, never fully disappeared. It is strange how endurance often hides in small things. The thread, though thin, did not break. As the 19th century wore on, a quiet resistance began to grow, not in the form of rebellion at first, but in the form of memory, a longing for the self-sufficiency that the looms had once given. Indian cotton had once clothed empires. Now it clothed colonial subjects. When visitors from England came to India, they often remarked on how underdressed the poor were, half-naked, some wrote, with a tone of pity or disdain. They did not see that this poverty was woven by their own factories. The muslin that once floated like mist on the skin was gone, replaced by imported cloth, rough and cold, in Bengal. The weavers' children learned other trades. The songs of the loom faded from the villages. Where there had once been the constant sound of weaving, the heartbeat of the countryside, there was now silence. And yet, across the world, people were now wrapped in cotton. From the working classes of Europe to the plantation fields of the Americas, the fabric that had begun in the monsoon villages became the universal cloth of modernity. Its story had come full circle, from hand to machine, from craft to industry, from local to global. The empire of threads had become the empire of steam in England. The industrialists grew rich, but their workers did not. The mills of Manchester were filled with poverty as deep as any village in India. The same cotton that displaced Indian weavers also trapped British laborers in long hours and suffocating conditions. The machine, in its cold efficiency, did not favor anyone for long. Back in India, one could still find, in the quiet of the countryside, an old weaver working by habit. He might have no customers left, but he still sits at his loom each morning. For him, Weaving is not a profession, but a rhythm of life. The warp threads stretch before him, the shuttle passes back and forth, and time itself seems to move with it. He has heard that there are new cities rising: Calcutta, Bombay, Madras, filled with foreign merchants and smoke-belching mills. He knows that his son will probably leave to work there. But for now, he keeps weaving, because that is what his hands remember. The history of cotton is not only the history of trade or empire. It is also the history of habit, of human persistence. Machines might speed the process, but the desire to make something soft, strong, and lasting from a fragile plant remains deeply human still. As the 19th century draws to a close, the quiet craft that once clothed empires seems almost gone. Its survival will depend not on merchants or machines, but on something else entirely. An idea that is only beginning to stir in India's future leaders. The thread will be picked up again, this time not by a weaver, but by a man with a spinning wheel and a dream of independence. But that belongs to another part of our story. For now, the looms of India are silent, and the machines of England hum through the night. The balance of power has shifted. The world has been rewoven, tighter, faster, but perhaps less beautifully. And somewhere in that silence lies a question that has not yet been answered. If the rhythm of human hands made the world's most desired cloth, what have we lost now that the machines hum in their place? If you walk through Rome today, past the marble columns, the ruins of temples, the echoing halls of ancient baths, it is easy to believe that the city was built entirely from stone and grandeur. But beneath that surface, hidden under layers of history and myth, lies something far more humble. Brick. Rome, the city of emperors and poets, was built not only by architects and generals, but by countless hands that shaped clay from the Tiber's banks into simple, sun-dried bricks. These small, rectangular forms, reddish, rough, easily forgotten, carried the weight of empires. Yet few remember the people who made them. In the quiet fields beyond the city walls, you might have once seen them at dawn. Men and women, their feet coated in mud, working beside shallow pits filled with clay. The air smelled of earth and smoke. Birds called from the riverbank. The work was slow and repetitive. Dig, mix, mold, dry, fire, stack. There were no monuments for these workers. No inscriptions of their names, only the marks. They pressed into wet clay before the bricks were sent away. And yet those marks, tiny fingerprints, thumb swipes, sometimes initials or symbols, can still be found today in the walls of the Colosseum, the baths of Caracalla, the Pantheon's dome. It is strange to think that the greatness of Rome stands upon the touch of so many ordinary lives. The Romans called the art of brickmaking, and though it might seem dull beside marble or mosaic, it was one of the most advanced crafts of the ancient world. Clay was abundant along the Tiber, soft and fine, perfect for shaping. But to make a durable brick required patience and a kind of quiet science passed down through generations. The process began in spring, when the rains had softened the riverbanks. Workers dug the clay in heavy baskets, sometimes mixing it with sand or crushed pottery to strengthen it. Then it was left to sit, to rest, as they said, for days or weeks, allowing the excess water to drain. The smell of wet earth filled the air, thick and mineral. The next stage was kneading, treading the clay with bare feet, turning and folding it. It had to be smooth, pliable, and slightly sticky. Too wet, and the bricks would warp. Too dry, and they would crack. The brickmakers did not measure with tools. They measured by feel. They could tell by the sound of their feet whether the clay was ready. Once prepared, the clay was pressed into wooden molds, forme latrum. Each mold was dusted with sand to prevent sticking. Children sometimes helped here, patting the clay flat with small hands. The bricks were then lifted carefully and left to dry in the sun for several days, turned periodically to prevent curling. Some bricks were left unbaked, adobes used for simple walls or temporary buildings. But the finest bricks were fired in kilns. This was the most delicate part. The temperature had to be controlled carefully. Too hot, and the bricks would crack. Too cool, and they would crumble. The firing could take days. Smoke rose over the countryside like mist when finished. The bricks were stacked in neat piles, stamped with small rectangular seals bearing the name of the workshop, the owner, or sometimes the emperor. These stamps became a kind of paperwork in clay, an early system of quality control. Archaeologists today use them to date buildings and trace the flow of production through the empire. For example, bricks stamped with Officina Domitiani tell us that the Emperor Domitian himself owned vast brickworks. Later emperors, like Hadrian, expanded this imperial network. By the 2nd century CE, brickmaking had become one of the most organized industries in the Roman world. But behind this system were people, the workers, who shaped, lifted, and fired the clay, often under the authority of wealthy landlords. Many were enslaved. Some were freedmen, others poor citizens. Their lives were measured not in years, but in the number of bricks they made each season. Imagine the rhythm of their day. At sunrise, the clay pits shimmered with dew. Workers stripped to tunics, wading knee-deep in mud. The air was cool at first, then heavy with heat as the sun rose. Lunch might be bread and olives eaten sitting on the ground. Conversation was sparse, partly from exhaustion, partly because words did not change the work by evening. The rows of drying bricks stretched across the field like reddish tiles. The workers washed in the river, their skin rough with clay dust. Fires glowed in the distance where the kilns burned through the night. There was dignity in the repetition, if not glory. Each brick was the same, yet each bore the mark of its maker. The Romans, practical as they were, valued such steady labor. Rome was not built in a day, the saying goes, and indeed it wasn't. It was built one brick at a time. As the empire grew, so did its hunger for building materials. From Gaul to Egypt, from Spain to Syria, Roman engineers brought with them the same techniques and the same quiet industry. They built roads, aqueducts, baths, and fortresses from brick and mortar, then covered them in marble to impress the eye. But beneath the marble, it was always the same humble material doing the work in the provinces. Local clay took on regional hues, yellow in North Africa, pale in Britain, almost purple in parts of Gaul. Each region developed its own style of brickmaking, but the method remained Roman, even far from the capital. The fingerprint of the empire was literal, impressed in clay. It is one of history's quiet miracles that brick, so fragile on its own, can last for millennia when placed in the right pattern. The Romans perfected this. using bricks not merely as walls but as structure, the bones of arches and domes. Consider the Pantheon, completed around 125 CE under Hadrian. Its vast dome, still the largest unreinforced concrete dome in the world, relies on layers of brick and concrete, each brick carrying its fraction of the weight. To stand beneath it today is to stand under the collective strength of countless small things, thousands of hands, thousands of baked pieces of earth. And yet, for all this achievement, the work remained anonymous. The emperors carved their names into marble, but the brickmakers left only initials pressed into mud. Their contribution was foundational, literally but invisible. Still, there were hints of individuality. Some ancient bricks bear fingerprints in decorative swirls, as if the maker had idly traced a pattern while working. Others have the imprint of sandals, or even a dog's paw, evidence that life went on amid labor. These small, unplanned marks are among the most human relics we have from antiquity. As centuries passed, the empire's architecture grew more ambitious. Giant bath complexes, vast amphitheaters, and soaring basilicas demanded millions of bricks. Entire villages were built around supplying them. Clay pits became permanent industries, with workers born and dying within sight of the same kilns. In these communities, time moved differently. Seasons were marked not by festivals, but by cycles of production. The digging in spring, the drying in summer, the firing before autumn rains. Winters were for repairing molds and clearing debris. Life followed the rhythm of clay. When the empire reached its peak, brickmaking was as essential as bread. Every city, every fort, every villa depended on it. And when the empire began to falter, when armies thinned and treasuries emptied, the brickmakers continued their work, almost unaffected. Bricks were needed in good times and bad. There is something almost meditative about that endurance. Empires rise and fall, but people still build walls, still need shelter, still press earth into shape. The clay remembers every age equally. Imagine now walking through a Roman construction site around the year 150 CE. The air is thick with dust. Mules carry loads of bricks from the kiln. Masons call out measurements. The sound of hammers echoes against half-finished arches. Stacks of bricks are arranged neatly by size bezels square, pedales foot long, and sesquipedales 1.5 feet long. A foreman checks the stamps on the bricks, marking which estate supplied them. In the midst of this, a cart arrives carrying fresh deliveries from a kiln owned by a wealthy woman named Domitia Lucilla, mother of the future emperor, Marcus Aurelius. Her family's brickworks, located near the Tiber, were among the most famous of their time. Even in this rough trade, the elite had a hand. Their wealth came from the labor of those who molded the clay. Somewhere in the background, a brickmaker wipes his hands on his tunic and looks at the walls rising higher each day. He does not know the names of the architects or the patrons. He knows only that his bricks will outlast him, and indeed, they have. If you look closely at the ruins of the Colosseum, you can still see the lines of Roman brick beneath later repairs, small, orderly, patient. They have survived earthquakes, fires, and centuries of neglect. The marble has fallen away. The brick remains. It is a humbling thought that the glory of Rome, so proud of its emperors and legions, rests on the quiet labor of people whose names were never written down by the late empire. As resources dwindled, recycling became common. Old bricks were pulled from collapsed buildings and used again. Some Roman walls are patchworks of centuries, layers of reused materials fitting together like a quilt. The clay, once shaped and fired, never truly died in that sense. Roman brickmaking was not only a craft but a philosophy, one that understood permanence through patience. A single brick is fragile. Together they endure, and perhaps that is the secret of why Rome lasted so long. Not its armies, not its emperors, but the discipline of its builders, the unglamorous persistence of people who believed that even small, repetitive labor could create something. The story of Indian cotton could have ended in silence, with the looms stilled, the weavers scattered, and the sound of machines drowning out the whisper of thread. But history, like cotton, has a way of being rewoven. By the late 19th century, India was changing. Steamships cut across its coasts, railways stitched its plains, and the telegraph carried the empire's orders faster than the wind. Yet beneath all this noise of progress, the memory of the old spinning wheel, the charkha, lingered quietly in the corners of Indian homes. Most people no longer wove for trade, but they still spun thread for daily life, simple cloth for the household, ritual garments for the temple, shawls for newborns. The charkha had become more than a tool. It was a piece of domestic rhythm, a small circle of calm amid the larger whirl of empire. And into this world of quiet decline came a man who listened carefully to small sounds. Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, educated in law and trained in Western thought, began to notice the threads that bound India and the threads. When he returned from South Africa in 1915, he saw villages still poor, still weaving survival from the barest means, still clothed in imported cloth from mills in Manchester. He realized something profound, that India's political subjugation was reflected in the very fabric of what people wore. Imported textiles had not only ruined local crafts, they had become a symbol of dependence itself. To wear foreign cloth was to wear the empire's power, a soft but constant reminder of who ruled and who served. So, Gandhi proposed something at once ordinary and revolutionary: to spin one's own thread again. At first, people laughed. In an age of railways and factories, the idea of returning to hand spinning seemed absurd. But Gandhi did not mean it merely as economics. He meant it as an act of reclaiming time, dignity, and identity. Each turn of the charkha, he said, was a small act of independence. He began spinning daily, often in the early morning. The sound of his wheel became part of his prayer. Others began to follow. Across the countryside, the charkha returned from storage. Old weavers taught young people again. Women who had never spoken in meetings began spinning together in courtyards. The movement grew quietly, thread by thread. By the 1920s, khadi, homespun cotton, became the symbol of resistance. It was coarse and uneven compared to the polished cloth of the mills, but that imperfection became its pride. To wear khadi was to reject foreign rule, to choose self-reliance over dependency. The British could forbid speeches, censor newspapers, and imprison protesters, but they could not stop people from spinning in villages across India. The faint, rhythmic sound of thousands of charkas filled the air again. Old men, women, and children all took part. Each thread added to a silent network of defiance. The same act that had once built empires through trade now began to unmake them through self-sufficiency. Meanwhile, in the great cities, Indian entrepreneurs began to build their own mills. In Bombay, Ahmedabad, and Coimbatore, local capitalists, some inspired by patriotism, others by profit, started spinning and weaving cloth for Indian markets. Ironically, they often used the very machines that had destroyed traditional weaving a century earlier. Yet now, these machines served a different purpose: the revival of an Indian-controlled industry. The story had turned upon itself. The same empire that had taken India's cotton to feed its factories now faced competition from Indian mills. But even as modern industry grew, Gandhi's vision of the charkha remained deeply symbolic. He saw it not as nostalgia, but as balance, a reminder that true independence required more than machines. It required the spirit of the people who once wove the world's cloth by hand. Still, the revival was uneven. Many traditional weavers could not return to their craft. The markets had changed, and mass production ruled. But khadi became something new, not a commercial product, but a statement of identity. It appeared in flags, ceremonies, and daily life. Politicians wore it to parliament. Activists wrapped themselves in it as they marched. Even those who could not spin often carried a small spindle as a sign of solidarity. Once a humble household tool, had become a national emblem outside India. People barely noticed the quiet symbolism. To them, khadi looked plain, even dull, but that dullness was its power. It rejected luxury, spectacle, and the bright dyes of industrial fashion. It spoke instead of patience, humility, and persistence, the same virtues that had once made India's cotton the envy of the world. As the decades passed and India moved toward independence, cotton once again became the thread that bound its story. From the earliest village weavers to the modern mills and the freedom movement, cotton had carried both wealth and suffering, beauty and loss. It was the empire's foundation and, ultimately, its unraveling. When India finally gained independence in 1947, Gandhi asked that the new national flag be made of khadi. It was not a matter of design, but of meaning. He wanted the symbol of the nation to be woven by the same hands that had once been silenced: the weavers, the spinners, the ordinary people who had turned thread into both survival and revolution. Today, if you travel through rural India, you may still find handlooms in use. The air smells faintly of oil and starch. The weaver sits in the half-light, guiding the shuttle as his ancestors did. Outside, fields of cotton sway in the breeze, white bowls glowing in the sun. Much of that cotton still goes to factories now, in India, China, or beyond, where machines hum day and night. But the handloom remains, stubborn and steady. Like a heartbeat, in some villages, the craft has been revived, not by necessity, but by pride. Artisans, cooperatives, supported by historians and preservationists, teach the old techniques again: block printing, natural dyeing, and fine weaving. The cloth they make is sold not by weight or speed, but by story. Each piece carries with it a trace of the old rhythm, the quiet patience of generations. Cotton's tale is not dramatic. It has no single hero or battle. It is the story of countless hands, mostly anonymous, mostly unseen, whose work connected continents and centuries. It is a reminder that the world we live in was built as much by ordinary labor as by great invention. And though much has changed, one truth remains: the act of spinning thread, of turning plant fiber into fabric, is still a kind of meditation. The charkha, the steady breath between movements, all of it slows time, anchors thought, and reminds us that history is not only written in wars and treaties, but also in the quiet persistence of those who make things with care as night falls in the countryside. You can almost imagine the scene repeating itself. A weaver finishes his day's work. He folds the cloth carefully, smoothing the creases. The lamp flickers. The sound of crickets begins outside. In the half-light, he looks at the fabric and sees more than thread. He sees continuity. The same hands that once wove for kings now weave for no one in particular. And yet the gesture carries meaning. The machines hum somewhere far away, but here the old rhythm remains, and as the weaver sets his shuttle down and blows out the lamp, the room falls silent, a silence not of loss, but of completion. The thread has come full circle. The story of Indian cotton is the story of how something ordinary became extraordinary, not through conquest or invention, but through endurance. From the monsoon coasts to the mills of Manchester, from the silence of the handloom to the spin of the charkha, the world was reshaped by this gentle fiber. It reminds us that even the quietest histories can change everything. The night air over Venice was never entirely dark, even when the moon hid behind the drifting mists of the lagoon. A faint red shimmer rose from the island of Murano, as though the earth itself breathed with fire. For centuries, the island had glowed like a coal at the edge of the city's watery heart, home to the furnaces that shaped one of the quietest yet most influential trades in European history, the art of glassmaking. You can imagine it, a city floating on water, yet dependent on flame. The rest of Venice slept behind shuttered windows, lulled by the sound of waves lapping against stone. But across the lagoon, in low brick buildings whose walls sweated with heat, men worked through the hours before dawn. Their hammers, their iron rods, their steady breaths into long pipes, all echoed faintly across the water. Murano's glassmakers were no ordinary craftsmen. They were custodians of secrets. The government of Venice had long ago decreed that no glassmaker could leave the island without permission, under threat of death. It wasn't cruelty, exactly. It was protection. The recipes for clear glass, for shimmering colors, for the nearly invisible threads that decorated chalices and mirrors, these were worth more than silver. And in the dim forges of Murano, the Republic had found a way to control both beauty and trade. The furnaces were constant companions. Each one burned through pine and alder wood, filling the workshops with a mixture of sweetness and ash. At the heart of the fire sat the crucible, a thick clay pot where sand, soda, and lime melted into a glowing orange soup. The glassmakers worked in silence, broken only by low instructions murmured in dialect. One man turned the blowpipe, another shaped the molten blob with wet wood or folded newspaper. Each movement was practiced, slow, and utterly without haste. The process could not be rushed. A single impatient gesture could destroy hours of work. There was a kind of discipline to their boredom. Day after day, year after year, they repeated the same motions, gathering, blowing, shaping, and yet, through that monotony, they achieved something almost alchemical. Venetian glass was clearer than any other in the world, so pure that it caught candlelight and returned it doubled, shimmering like frozen breath. To outsiders, it was magic. To the men of Murano, it was chemistry, timing, and an unspoken trust between fire and hand. The Guild of Glassmakers, the Arte dei Vetri, ruled over its members with quiet precision. Apprentices began their training as boys, sweeping ash and carrying sand before being allowed to touch a pipe. Masters passed their skills through gestures rather than words. Many were illiterate, yet could read the color of molten glass as easily as another man might read a map. The guild kept meticulous records, names, births, apprenticeships, all sealed in waxed ledgers. But their true records were the furnaces themselves. Every master maintained his own mixture of minerals, the ratios guarded like inheritance. To reveal them to outsiders was to betray the Republic. To steal them was treason. In the dim light, a master's hand was as valuable as gold, and yet few left the island. The glassmakers lived, married, and died under the smoke of the same chimneys. Their families intermarried, forming a kind of hereditary order. Sons followed fathers into the workshop. Daughters were married off to other guild families, ensuring the secrets stayed within Murano's narrow lanes. By morning, when the city's bells began to toll, the fires were still burning. The men wiped sweat from their faces, their eyes ringed with fatigue. The island's canals glowed faintly, the air heavy with salt and soot. Across the water, Venice was stirring to life, merchants opening shutters, priests preparing for mass, fishermen setting out. Few of them thought about Murano's night work, but without those unseen hands, the Republic's wealth and splendor would have dimmed long ago. Glass was Venice's silent ambassador. Its chandeliers hung in palaces from Paris to Constantinople. Its mirrors, polished to unnatural clarity, reflected the faces of queens. Its beads traveled along trade routes to Africa and the New World. Each carried with it a whisper of the furnaces that never slept, and yet, for all its beauty, the work was slow and merciless. The heat scarred the men's hands and faces. The furnaces consumed enormous amounts of wood, forcing ships to bring timber from distant forests. There were no shortcuts, only patience, repetition, and an understanding of when to stop. The masters called it sentire, il vetro, to feel the glass. It was not something that could be written down or taught directly. You either felt it or you did not. Some apprentices never did. Sometimes, when the furnaces burned low in the early hours, the men would rest their pipes on the bench and sit in silence. Outside, the lagoon shimmered faintly with moonlight. From the mainland came the faint cry of a bird. The men would talk then about the fire, about the glass that refused to shape properly, about rumors of spies who had tried to escape the island with stolen formulas. There were always stories. One told of a glassmaker who fell in love with a foreign woman, confessed his secrets to her, and was never seen again. Another claimed that certain masters could make glass as thin as breath, and that it sang softly when struck. No one knew how much was true. Murano was full of half-truths and heat-mirages. To live there was to live between water and fire, a balance few could sustain for long. The glassmakers of Murano rarely left written records of themselves. Their work was anonymous, unsigned. Only occasionally did a piece survive with a family mark scratched discreetly beneath the base, a sign that someone, somewhere, wanted to be remembered. Centuries later, visitors would marvel at the chandeliers, goblets, and mirrors that filled European museums. But they would not see the scars, the sleepless nights, the quiet monotony of the men who made them. The beauty survived. The boredom was forgotten. Yet perhaps it was the boredom that made it possible, the endless, repetitive patience of men who watched sand melt night after night, until it caught the light like frozen fire. And so, in that still hour before dawn, as the furnaces sighed and the canals cooled, the masters of Murano continued their work, guarding secrets older than their own names. But how long could those secrets stay hidden in a world that was beginning to trade not just goods, but knowledge itself? As the sun sets over the ruins today, you can still run your hand along those ancient bricks. They are warm to the touch, the surface worn smooth by centuries of weather. Somewhere beneath your fingers may be the faint trace of a worker's fingerprint, preserved in clay since the time of Hadrian. It is not the touch of a hero or a god, just a person, long forgotten, who pressed earth into form and gave it to the world. And that, quietly, is how empires are built, unresolved thought, when the marble crumbles and the monuments fade. Will our own creations, the steel, the concrete, the glass, last as long as the humble brick? The Roman Empire, by the 2nd century CE, had reached a peculiar kind of perfection. Its borders were wide and mostly secure. Its roads stitched together distant provinces. Its cities hummed with administration, trade, and the unglamorous duties of governance. But beneath this surface of grandeur, an enormous network of quiet labor sustained it all. At the heart of that system was a simple equation: clay plus fire plus time. Rome's expansion required endless supplies of brick, not just for temples and amphitheaters, but for warehouses, bathhouses, barracks, aqueducts, and the invisible foundations beneath marble facades. Every governor's palace, every frontier fort, every villa by the sea drew its strength from the same humble material. And that meant brickmakers were everywhere. If you could travel the empire by road, say, the Via Appia or the Via Flaminia, you would pass through landscapes dotted with brick kilns. From the air had the Romans flown, they would have looked like quiet hives, circular ovens built of the very material they produced. Low smoke, drifting above them day and night. Each kiln complex was part factory, part community. The Romans called them figlinae, a word that meant both clay pit and pottery works. Some belonged to private landowners, others to imperial estates. The largest were run like military operations, complete with overseers, labor rosters, and supply chains to feed the kilns. Wood was needed, vast amounts of it. Forests near the Tiber and along the Alban hills were steadily stripped to fire the bricks that would build the capital. In later centuries, this deforestation became so severe that brickmakers had to transport firewood from miles away, floating it down rivers on barges. The process itself was exacting. Once dried under the sun, bricks were stacked in a kiln with narrow vents between them. The firing had to be even a delicate art. If the flame burned too hot in one area, the bricks there would fuse or crack. If too cool, they would crumble. Workers monitored the temperature by color. Pale orange meant moderate heat. Deep red, black meant failure. It was said that a skilled fireman could tell the heat of a kiln simply by the tone of its hum. The firing often took 3 or 4 days, followed by slow cooling. The kilns glowed through the night, their smoke mingling with the mist of the river valleys. To the untrained eye, it might have looked like dozens of small volcanoes breathing in rhythm, and once a batch was done, the workers' hands, calloused, faces blackened, would test the bricks by tapping them together. A clear ring meant success. A dull thud meant a flaw. The flawed ones, of course, were not discarded. They were crushed, mixed back into clay, and reborn in the next firing. Nothing was wasted in the Roman world, not even failure. The empire's greatest building boom came under Emperor Hadrian. Between 117 and 138 CE, a lover of architecture and detail, Hadrian was himself a trained engineer. He believed buildings should be practical, yet eternal, and for that, brick was indispensable. He ordered the expansion of imperial brickworks and introduced new regulations. Each batch of bricks had to bear a stamp, the name of the workshop, the consul in office, and often the year. This turned every brick into a dated document, a fragment of bureaucratic history baked in clay. Today, these stamps are the reason archaeologists can reconstruct the chronology of Roman construction so precisely. For instance, the Pantheon's bricks bear stamps from between 118 and 125 CE, perfectly matching Hadrian's reign. But these stamps also tell quieter stories. Some carry the names of freedmen, former slaves who managed brick factories on behalf of their patron. Others include symbols like anchors or animals, hinting at personal pride or small acts of identity within the vast machinery of empire. A typical stamp might read, Officina Domitia Vicili Cos, 2. This meant from the workshop of Domitia Lucilla. During the second consulship of the named consul, Domitia Lucilla, mother of Marcus Aurelius, owned several such figlinae near Rome. Her estates produced thousands of bricks that built everything from aqueducts to temples. Even emperors' mothers, it seemed, dealt in clay. And yet, for every noble name stamped into a brick, there were hundreds of unnamed hands that shaped it. Slow down and step inside one of these figlinae during the Empire's golden age. Its dawn on the outskirts of Rome. The air smells of damp earth and smoke. A low mist hangs over the clay pits. Workers are already at their tasks. Men mixing clay in long troughs, women smoothing it into wooden molds, children carrying finished bricks to the drying racks. The sound is steady and rhythmic, almost like breathing. Slap, scrape, lift, repeat. Nearby, the kilns glow faintly from the previous night's firing. A foreman moves among the workers with a wax tablet, noting quantities, checking the alignment of bricks as they dry. Each worker knows their role. The pace is slow but unending. By midday, the sun beats down and the clay starts to dry faster than expected. The workers cover the racks with woven mats to prevent cracking. Others prepare a new batch of fuel for the kilns, bundles of brushwood tied with twine. Lunch is bread dipped in oil, shared under a piece of shade. Conversations are brief, but not joyless. Someone hums an old tune from the countryside. Another jokes that the kiln is hotter than Vulcan's forge. Laughter rises, then fades back into work. It is a day like any other, a day that will repeat 1,000 times. The Roman brickmakers, despite their anonymity, were part of something extraordinary, the creation of a standardized architectural language that spread across continents, from the deserts of Egypt to the rainy hills of Britannia. Roman bricks spoke the same geometry. You could measure a wall in Gaul and find it aligned with one in Cappadocia. This consistency made the empire's buildings instantly recognizable. A Roman fort in Germany looked remarkably like one in Syria. The bricks were the same size, the arches the same shape. This uniformity was not aesthetic but logistical, a result of the empire's deep, boring efficiency. Roman engineers valued predictability. They trusted a brick stamped in one province to fit alongside those from another. It was a kind of architectural bureaucracy, each brick a unit in a vast imperial code. Even in this dull repetition, there was genius. Bricks built not only walls but infrastructure. Consider the aqueducts that carried water into cities, those graceful arches spanning valleys and hills. Though often faced with stone, their inner cores were brick and mortar. The combination of fired clay and volcanic ash created opus cementitium, the Roman concrete that has outlasted centuries in bathhouses. Bricks lined the hypocaust system's hollow floors and walls through which hot air flowed. Some bricks were specially made with curved edges or hollow centers to distribute heat more evenly. These technical details, invisible to the bathers, reveal an empire obsessed with material performance. Even roofs depended on brick. The Romans used tegulae and imbrisses, flat and curved tiles arranged to shed rainwater efficiently. Thousands of such tiles have been unearthed across Europe, each one stamped, fired, and laid by hand. Through brick, the Romans mastered the interplay of fire and water, earth and air. Their buildings were not only strong but breathable, capable of withstanding the damp winters of the north and the heat of the Mediterranean sun. Every time you see a Roman ruin standing open to the weather, know that it survives not by accident but by design. Yet, behind that endurance was an economy of exhaustion. Brickmaking was relentless, dirty work. The clay clung to everything. The smoke stung the eyes. Kiln fires burned through the night, demanding constant tending. The workers were paid little, if at all. Many were enslaved, and still they endured. Perhaps they found meaning in the rhythm, or in the thought that what they made might last beyond their lives. Perhaps they found pride in the sheer durability of their craft. For in Rome, the permanence of stone depended entirely on the labor of clay. In this quiet industry, there is something profoundly human, the desire to leave behind a mark, however small, in the world's fabric. By the 3rd century CE, the empire began to falter under its own weight. Political instability, inflation, and border pressures drained resources. Yet, remarkably, brickmaking persisted. Even as emperors rose and fell in rapid succession, new walls continued to rise, city defenses, military outposts, emergency repairs. The great building boom slowed, but the kilns did not go cold. In some ways, the brickworks were the most stable part of Rome's economy. They outlasted emperors and dynasties, serving whoever needed walls. When the capital shifted east to Constantinople, brickmaking went with it, carrying the old techniques into a new age. It's a reminder that even as civilizations change shape, the fundamental crafts endure. If you could have asked a Roman brickmaker what he thought of the grand buildings his bricks formed, he might have shrugged. To him, it was just work, the same motions, day after day. The splendor belonged to others, and yet 2,000 years later, we marvel not at the emperor's names carved in marble, but at the survival of those ordinary bricks. They were not meant to be beautiful. They were meant to last. Unresolved thought. When an empire is remembered for its art and glory, who remembers the hands that built its foundations? And does true immortality belong to the rulers or to the bricks that outlive them? When Rome began to crumble, it did not happen with a roar, but a slow settling, like dust after a long day of labor. The marble chipped, the roads cracked, the aqueducts dried. But beneath the decay, something quiet remained. The brick, even as the empire's grandeur faded. The bricks endured patient, unmoving, still doing their work. You can trace the survival of Rome not through the emperor's names, but through the persistence of these fired blocks of earth. They became the city's secret bones. In the 5th century CE, after the fall of the Western Empire, Rome was no longer the capital of the world. Its population shrank. Its baths went cold. Its temples turned to ruins. Yet the bricks stayed. When medieval builders came centuries later, scavenging materials from the ruins, they did not find piles of raw stone waiting for them. They found walls already made perfect, ready to be pulled out and reused. The Romans had built so well that even their debris was valuable. A mason in the year 800, repairing a church or fortress, might have used bricks once part of a Roman bathhouse. The same clay, shaped under an emperor, now served a bishop, and when later generations rebuilt again, they reused those same bricks once more. The layers of Rome became a palimpsest of clay every age, pressing its own architecture into the remains of the last dot in the Renaissance. When scholars and artists began to dig into the ancient ruins, they too found the marks of brickmakers, stamps still legible after 15 centuries, fingerprints frozen in fired earth. The great architect Leon Battista Alberti, who studied Roman construction in the 15th century, admired not only the grand designs, but the craftsmanship of the materials themselves. He noted that Roman bricks were so well baked, so equal in thickness, and so exactly cut that they could stand for eternity. To him, they were more than building materials. They were evidence of a civilization's discipline. And he was right. For all the talk of legions and laws, what truly united the Roman world was its craft, the endless repetition of ordinary work, done with care. Let's walk now, slowly, through the ruins of the baths of Caracalla. Built in the early 3rd century, the marble has mostly gone, carried away to decorate later churches and palaces. The statues are gone too, but the brickwork, the unseen skeleton of the baths, remains. Each arch, each fragment of wall, reveals the methodical precision of the builders. Horizontal courses of thin bricks alternate with thicker layers of mortar, forming a pattern the Romans called opus latericium. If you look closely, you can still see faint impressions, the edges of bricks cut to fit curves, the seams where scaffolding once stood. even the remnants of the stamps that named their makers. A soft breeze moves through the hollow spaces where steam once rose. The sound of footsteps echoes faintly against the brick. You realize that this, more than the grandeur of marble, is what lasts the geometry of patience. It's easy to forget that Roman brickmakers were among the first in history to standardize production. Long before factories or modern engineering, they created an empire-wide network of uniform materials. Brick made near the Tiber could fit seamlessly beside one made in North Africa or Gaul. This uniformity allowed Roman architects to plan vast structures with confidence, knowing that every component would align. Today, archaeologists find these bricks everywhere, in the ruins of London's Roman Wall, in the baths of Trier, in the remains of villas on the shores of the Black Sea. Each one is a small piece of a vanished order. They tell a story of logistics and persistence, the kind of story history books rarely linger on because it lacks drama. Yet without it, nothing grand could have stood by late antiquity. Brickmaking had become so ingrained in Roman life that even the word brick passed into many later languages unchanged. The Latin later gave rise to laterizio in Italian, ladrillo in Spanish, brick in French, brick in English. The craft outlived the empire that invented it, and wherever those descendants went, across medieval Europe, into the Islamic world, across the Atlantic, they carried with them the same humble logic that civilization depends not on splendor, but on structure. You could say that the Roman brick became a kind of silent ambassador of the empire, spreading not through conquest, but through construction. Even the Byzantines, who inherited Rome's eastern provinces, continued the tradition. Their architects refined the art of brick and mortar, combining it with new materials to build the great domes of Constantinople, the Hagia Sophia, for example, completed in 537 CE, rests upon layers of brick so thin and light that they seem to float. Many of those bricks were made using techniques unchanged since Hadrian's day. Each one was fired, tested, and laid by hand. If you touch its walls, you are feeling the same continuity, clay pressed and fired by people who might never have heard of Rome, yet carried its quiet knowledge. Back in the West, in the slow centuries of medieval rebuilding, brick again became essential. When marble was scarce and stone too heavy to quarry, clay was abundant. Towns like Pisa, Siena, and Florence rose on foundations of recycled Roman brick. In northern Europe, where stone was rarer, entire Gothic cathedrals were built from brick alone. Red monuments of patience, the so-called brick Gothic style, stretching across Germany, Poland, and the Baltic, was in many ways the afterlife of Roman craftsmanship. Even the word Roman itself came to describe not just an empire, but a method, opus Romanum, the Roman way of building. And so the legacy of those long-forgotten brickmakers continued, reshaped by each new generation, as steady and silent as the material itself. Imagine, for a moment, the life of one such worker, a man or woman whose name we'll never know. Their world was not glorious. It was muddy, smoky, and repetitive. They likely worked from childhood until their hands stiffened. They did not read or write. They would never see the finished buildings their bricks helped to raise. Yet, unknowingly, they were part of something vast and lasting, a continuity that would stretch across millennia. Their fingerprints remain in the clay. Their breath is trapped in tiny air bubbles beneath the glaze. Their touch holds the memory of effort long since forgotten. It is a humbling kind of immortality. Today, visitors to Rome often walk past walls of ancient brick without noticing them. They are not as dazzling as marble or mosaic. But for those who pause, there's something deeply peaceful in their repetition, the endless rhythm of rectangles, each one placed by hand, still holding its form after 2,000 years under the shifting light of afternoon. The bricks take on the color of old sunsets, soft, reddish gold. Between them grows moss, and in the cracks, small ferns. Time has turned architecture into landscape, and perhaps that is the truest legacy of Rome's builders. Not the monuments that remain, but the patience they teach us to see. To build something lasting, they remind us, is to work quietly, steadily, without expectation of fame. As evening falls, the ruins grow cooler. Shadows stretch along the walls. You can almost imagine the faint scent of smoke from long-dead kilns drifting through the air. Somewhere, the echo of footsteps, perhaps yours, joins the rhythm of all those who walked here before. Every city has its hidden architects, its forgotten makers. The Roman brickmakers may not have known that their work would endure through wars, empires, and ages, but in a way, that unawareness makes their endurance even more profound. They built not for eternity, but for necessity, and yet eternity found them anyway. When we speak of Rome as eternal, we often think of the Caesars, the temples, the marble splendor. But eternity, it turns out, rests on simpler things. The slow, uncelebrated craft of those who shaped earth with care. Fire hardened their clay. Time hardened their legacy. And so the city still stands, not on myths or glory, but on patience baked into every brick. Reflection. When you next see a wall, any wall, look closely at its pattern, at the quiet order of its lines. Somewhere in that rhythm lives the same human instinct that built Rome, to make something steady in an unsteady world. And though centuries pass, the brick still holds its shape. By the dawn of the 17th century, the fires of Murano had burned for more than 300 years. Generations of men had lived and died beneath their glow. Their hands hardened by heat, their eyes trained to read the subtle colors of molten sand. From the outside, little seemed to change. The same furnaces, the same canals, the same quiet pride in their craft. And yet, beneath that steady rhythm, something invisible was shifting. The world beyond Venice was no longer the same. The secrets that had once made Murano the envy of Europe were now slipping away like smoke through a cracked chimney. Bohemian glassmakers in the forests of Central Europe had discovered new ways to harden their glass with potash, producing pieces that sparkled with a brilliance unknown to the Venetians. English craftsmen in London had begun experimenting with lead crystal, giving their glass a heavier, diamond-like sheen. The Republic of Venice watched these developments with growing unease. Their ambassadors sent back reports of foreign forgeries, glass so fine it could pass for Murano's own. The Senate issued decrees forbidding exports of raw materials and restricting who could teach glassmaking. But the tide could not be stopped. The world had grown larger, faster, more connected. Ideas traveled now, not just goods. And for the glassmakers of Murano, that was a quiet tragedy. Imagine a master at his furnace in 1605, his beard silvered by age, his skin permanently flushed by heat. He has worked here since boyhood, breathing the same smoke his father breathed. The tools on his bench are worn smooth from decades of use. Each motion of his hand is muscle memory. He still believes in the old ways, the exact temperature of the furnace, the rhythm of turning the blowpipe, the way to cool the glass slowly in the unkneeling chamber. But he can sense, as all old craftsmen eventually do, that the world no longer revolves around his trade. Ships no longer stop in Venice as they once did. The spice routes have shifted toward the Atlantic. The merchants grow richer in Amsterdam, not the lagoon. And the furnaces of Murano, though they still burn brightly, no longer hold the same place in the imagination of Europe. Still, the guild endures. The Arte dei Vetri continues to meet in its stone hall. The masters still argue about apprenticeships and prices. The apprentices still swear their oaths of secrecy. There are even new experiments: colored enamels, intricate filigree glass, malefiori beads that seem to bloom like flowers frozen in crystal. But the guild knows, silently, collectively, that its age of absolute supremacy is fading, and perhaps that is why. During this period, the glassmakers began to record more of their craft. For centuries, everything had been passed orally, from father to son, from master to apprentice. Now, as Europe's hunger for knowledge grew, even the Venetians began to write. A handful of fragile manuscripts survive, not full recipes, but fragments of memory, lists of minerals, temperatures, and notes written in dialect. Some were hidden deliberately, as if the authors feared discovery. Others were donated to libraries by descendants who no longer worked the furnaces. One such book, attributed to a Murano craftsman named Antonio Neri, became a bridge between worlds. In 1612, Neri published L'Art Vitri, the Art of Glass. It was the first systematic study of glassmaking ever printed. Gathering centuries of knowledge into a single text, Neri was not a typical glassmaker. He had studied alchemy and theology, and he wrote with a curiosity that blended craft with science. His book revealed just enough of Murano's secrets to inspire imitation, but not enough to fully replace them. Still, its impact was profound. Across Europe, scholars and craftsmen began to experiment, to test, to refine. The guarded island of fire had, at last, shared its flame with the world. Back on Murano, the masters continued their work. Some resented Neri's openness. Others saw it as inevitable. The younger generation spoke of new markets, new customers, new designs. The old ones muttered about betrayal, but even in their resentment, they could not deny a truth. The world was moving forward, and yet something of Murano's spirit endured, even as its monopoly vanished. The glassmakers' lives remained shaped by the same rhythms, the same slow patience that had always defined their art. They still gathered at dawn, still turned their pipes in silence, still trusted the shimmer of molten glass more than the promises of merchants. A visitor to the island around 1650 might have been surprised to find how little had changed. The streets were quiet except for the hum of furnaces. The canals reflected both smoke and sunlight. Children still played near the workshops. their laughter mingling with the hiss of cooling glass. Inside the forges, the air shimmered with heat. Masters worked, bare-chested, their muscles moving with the precision of dancers. Apprentices stood by, watching every gesture. The tools, shears, paddles, molds, were passed from hand to hand like relics. And still, the masters spoke of the fire as if it were alive. Feed it too fast, one would say, and it burns jealous. Too slow, and it sleeps. Every furnace has a mood, another might add. You must learn to listen. It was not science. It was something older, a relationship between human patience and natural chaos. That was Murano's real secret. Not the recipes, nor the minerals, nor the furnaces themselves, but the patience required to wait for perfection. Because glass, like history, demands time. It must be heated, cooled, tested, and trusted. Rush the process, and it cracks. Handle it too roughly, and it shatters. But treat it with quiet persistence, and it endures, translucent, fragile, and timeless. As centuries passed, wars came and went. Venice's empire crumbled, and the Republic faded into memory. But the island's furnaces never went dark. They burned through plague, invasion, and poverty. Even when the rest of Europe industrialized, Murano's glassmakers kept to their handcraft, shaping molten light by touch and breath. In the modern world, tourists stroll those same narrow streets. They watch demonstrations in glass-blowing workshops, buy vases and ornaments, and marvel at the skill of the artisans. Few realize that the men before them are the descendants of those first masters, inheritors of secrets once guarded by law and flame. The furnaces are now powered by gas, not pine wood. The recipes are no longer punishable by death if revealed, but the rhythm remains unchanged. The island still glows faintly at night, a reflection of centuries of work. And somewhere, deep in a workshop that smells faintly of ash and salt, a craftsman turns his pipe slowly, shaping molten glass with a steady hand. His movements are the same as those of his ancestors, deliberate, careful, almost meditative. He does not hurry. He cannot. The glass won't allow it. Outside, the lagoon ripples in the breeze. The sound of a passing boat fades into silence. The furnace hums. The master lifts his creation to the light, a thin, clear vessel that catches the sun and scatters it in every direction. It is, for a moment, perfect. Then he sets it down and begins again. For that is the quiet truth of the Murano glassmakers. Their art was never about beauty alone. It was about endurance, about the patient repetition of a craft so precise it became almost invisible, and about the human hands that shaped it across centuries of heat and boredom. Even now, their legacy lingers in every fragment of glass that glows faintly when struck by light, a whisper of fire, a memory of sand, and a reminder that even the dullest labors can outlast empires. And perhaps that is the most enduring secret of all. By the time dawn light spilled across the lagoon, the fires on Murano had already been stoked again. The men who had worked through the night would take only a brief rest before returning to the furnaces. The rhythm was relentless. Flame, glass, rest, repeat. It had to be. The glass never waited to live as a Murano glassmaker in the 15th or 16th century was to live inside a quiet confinement, not of iron bars, but of fire and secrecy. The Republic of Venice had built its wealth on trade, spices from the East, wool from England, and above all, glass from Murano. The city's Senate understood this well. The glassmaker's knowledge was not just valuable, it was strategic. That is why, in 1291, an official decree had forced all glass furnaces to move from Venice to the island of Murano. The city fathers feared fire. Of course, the furnaces had burned down neighborhoods before. But there was another reason, unspoken and far more deliberate: isolation. By moving the glassmakers to their own island, Venice could keep their techniques under constant watch. You can picture it, a world of canals and furnaces, of narrow lanes lined with ash-coated workshops. Men moved through the heat carrying rods of glowing glass, their faces orange in the firelight. Apprentices fetched wood and cleaned the ashes, their arms dark with soot. And always, behind every motion, was the quiet knowledge that they could not leave. If a glassmaker tried to run away, the penalties were severe. The Republic's records are clear and unemotional: confiscation of property, imprisonment, and sometimes assassination by hired men sent abroad. The glassmaker's art was not his own. It belonged to Venice, and yet the island was not a prison in the ordinary sense. Murano was prosperous. Its masters lived in fine houses along the canals, and their families were respected in the city. They dressed well, attended church in silk, and held positions of quiet power. Some even married into noble families, blurring the lines between artisan and aristocrat. The guild Arte dei Vetri regulated every part of their lives. It set prices, approved designs, assigned apprentices, and oversaw the transfer of furnaces from one master to another. Within its walls, the hierarchy was absolute. The maestri, or masters, held the most authority. Beneath them were the lavranti, the skilled workers, and below them, the garzoni boys, who began at 12 or 13, sweeping the floors and learning to endure the heat. The guild's meetings were held in a stone hall near the center of the island. Its records, written in a careful, slanted hand, still survive. They show fines for lateness, disputes over apprentices, and complaints about stolen sand or defective clay crucibles. To read them is to see the quiet bureaucracy that kept the fires burning. Every furnace was both a workshop and a secret laboratory. The recipes for glass were memorized, not written. A single pinch of manganese could turn clear glass into pale violet. A handful of cobalt gave it a deep blue. The addition of gold dust made it glow red like embers. But these recipes were not shared lightly. An apprentice might spend 7 years just learning to recognize the right color of molten glass before being told even a fraction of the formulas. When he finally took his oath as a maestro, he swore before the guild and the church to guard the secrets as one guards the salvation of the soul. Breaking that oath meant exile, or worse. The Venetian Senate rewarded loyalty lavishly. Skilled glassmakers received privileges denied to other artisans: immunity from certain taxes, the right to carry swords, and permission to wear fine clothes. But those privileges came with chains. Some men, over time, grew restless. Tales spread of masters who vanished into the night, smuggled away by foreign agents. France, the Ottoman Empire, and even distant Persia sent spies to Venice, hoping to lure a glassmaker abroad. The Republic watched closely. Ambassadors were instructed to report sightings of fugitives of the furnace. One name appears again and again in the archives: Angelo Barovier. He lived in the mid-15th century and was considered a genius of his craft. He is credited with perfecting cristallo, a glass so pure and transparent that it seemed made of solidified air. Cristallo became the envy of Europe, used for everything from goblets to mirrors to ornate reliquaries. Barovier's workshop stood near the edge of Murano's main canal, where the smell of wood smoke mingled with salt water. He was said to have worked in near silence, with a precision that bordered on the obsessive. When his apprentices made mistakes, he corrected them not with anger, but with an expression of quiet disappointment, a far more effective punishment. His formula for cristallo became the guild's crown jewel. The Senate protected it with layers of decrees, ensuring it could not be copied elsewhere. But even Barovier could not control how his work would echo through time. Within a century, other cities, Bohemia, Nuremberg, and Lyon, began to produce their own versions, less perfect but close enough. Secrets, no matter how tightly held, have a way of escaping inside the Guildhall. Debates grew sharper. Should they adapt, innovate, or retreat into secrecy? Some masters began experimenting with glass mosaics and enamel painting, creating intricate designs for churches and noble houses. Others focused on lenses and mirrors, tools that would later shape science itself. You can imagine the discussions, the low voices around the guild's long wooden table. If we sell more to France, we risk imitation. If we sell less, we lose our ships. And what then, when the fire grows cold? Outside those meetings, the daily life of the island continued, much as it always had. The children played by the canals, chasing sparks that drifted from the chimneys. The older men sat in doorways, their faces lined by heat and age, talking about the weather and the rising cost of ashwood. The women kept the houses spotless, the floors dusted with powdered shells to keep away dampness. They too were part of the quiet rhythm of glassmaking, though their labor was invisible. Some prepared the mineral powders, washing them to remove impurities. Others polished beads and mirrors until their hands grew raw. At night, the furnaces roared again. The masters returned to their benches, turning pipes slowly, shaping molten blobs with gestures older than words. The glow from their fires painted the lagoon orange. Passing sailors said it looked like a city of sleeping dragons. And in a sense, it was. Each furnace a dragon's mouth, each craftsman a keeper of flame. There is something strangely peaceful about that image, an island that never slept, glowing faintly through the centuries, its people bound by duty and heat. But under that calm surface, cracks had begun to form. The world was changing. The printing press had made information harder to contain. Scholars across Europe were experimenting with chemistry, optics, and mineralogy. The age of alchemy was giving way to the age of science. The glassmakers of Murano, once unrivaled, now faced rivals they could not control. And so, as the 16th century wore on, whispers began to spread among the guild. What if the Republic's protection had become a prison? What if the secrets they guarded were already slipping away? The furnaces still glowed, but the island's quiet confidence had begun to waver, a faint flicker in the heart of the flame. You imagine the Netherlands in the middle of the 17th century. The air is damp, the canals reflective, and the sound of wooden cartwheels rolls faintly over cobblestones slick with the mist of the North Sea in Delft. The scent of earth and coal mingles in the narrow streets that lead toward the potter's quarters. The city is not large, but it hums quietly with the rhythm of industry, breweries, cloth mills, and above all, kilns. If you were to stand in one of those narrow lanes at dawn, you might see men and women already bent over their work. Some haul sacks of river clay, others carry boards laden with pale, unfired tiles. Somewhere a potter's wheel spins, not fast, not hurried, but steady. There is no glamour here, no wealth in the touch of clay, only repetition and the quiet endurance of hands that have learned to shape patience itself. The clay came from the beds of rivers that crossed the Dutch countryside, heavy, fine-grained, and pale. It was not the white porcelain of China, nor the reddish earthenware of Italy, but something humbler. The potters of Delft did not have the kiln that made porcelain shine like snow, but they had something else, an unshakable curiosity, and a willingness to imitate. The 1600s were the age of trade. The Dutch East India Company sent ships across oceans, returning with spices, silk, and porcelain from Asia. Those Chinese wares, painted in delicate blue and white, became a sensation among wealthy Europeans. They were translucent, light, and impossibly refined, something no European kiln could reproduce. But imitation in Delft was not shameful. It was survival. You can picture the first Delft potters examining a broken shard of porcelain under the gray winter light. They tapped it, listening to the ring. Porcelain sang faintly, like glass. Their own earthenware gave only a dull thud, but perhaps, they thought, if they covered their coarse clay with a fine white glaze, they could make something that appeared the same, something that caught the eye, even if it did not sing. The secret lay in tin glaze. Tin, when ground into powder and mixed with lead and sand, created a smooth, opaque coating when fired. The potters borrowed the idea from Italy, where majolica had long been made in brilliant colors. But Delft potters stripped away the brightness, preferring restraint. White glaze, blue decoration. It was not meant to dazzle. It was meant to calm, to suggest distance, to echo the blue of the northern sky, reflected in still canals, in the workshops. You would have found every stage of production carefully divided. Clay was soaked in water until it softened. The impurities, pebbles, bits of root were removed by hand. The clay was then kneaded, beaten, and left to rest. A potter sat at his wheel, guiding his hands around a lump of spinning clay, shaping it into plates, bowls, vases. The rhythm was hypnotic, the slow rise of form from formlessness. When the pieces were dry enough to hold their shape, apprentices carried them to the kiln for the first firing, the biscuit firing. The heat turned them from soft earth into a porous, pale body. Then they were dipped in the tin glaze, thick, milky, and cool. After that, the surface was ready to receive the painter's touch. The painters were the quiet storytellers of Delftware. Using brushes made of squirrel hair, they painted landscapes, ships, flowers, and geometric borders in a cobalt pigment imported from Persia. The cobalt oxide turned black when wet. It transformed into the vivid blue that became Delft's signature, the color of distant seas and quiet dreams. Each brushstroke had to be confident, because the glaze absorbed quickly. There was no second chance. Some painters traced outlines lightly in charcoal first, others painted freehand, trusting in years of practice. A mistake could not be corrected. But sometimes, small imperfections, a slightly uneven border, a blur of blue, made the piece more human, more serene. The kilns were fired for days. Wood and peat were piled into the chamber, flames licking upward, the heat building slowly. Inside, the painted clay pieces transformed glaze, melting into glass, pigment fusing into the surface. The potters knew the process by smell, by sound, by the color of the firelight through the peephole in the kiln wall. There were no thermometers, only experience. Too cool, and the glaze stayed dull. Too hot, and the pieces warped or cracked. And yet, for every batch ruined by uneven heat, another emerged perfect, pale white, the blue patterns soft and deep. The potters stacked them on shelves, letting them cool overnight, listening to the faint tinkling sound of glaze contracting as it hardened. When the first light of morning touched Delft, the potters opened their kilns. Inside, hundreds of quiet blue stories waited, ships sailing nowhere, flowers blooming eternally, women carrying water, windmills turning against painted skies. These were not portraits of grandeur or drama, but of stillness. In a century of trade, empire, and war, Delft Blue spoke of peace, of domestic calm, of the patient art of making beauty from the most ordinary earth. The success of Delftware grew rapidly. Merchants carried it to Amsterdam, to London, to Hamburg. In the homes of the wealthy, it sat beside real Chinese porcelain, indistinguishable at first glance. Even the Dutch East India Company, which had brought porcelain from the East, began to order Delftware for its officers and sailors, a curious reversal, the imitation replacing the original. But within Delft itself, the work remained humble. The Potters' Guild, the Guild of St. Luke, oversaw every workshop. Membership required years of apprenticeship and a fee that many struggled to afford. The guild kept strict control over quality and production, ensuring that every piece bore the mark of its maker. Yet, even with these rules, life for most potters was precarious. Kilns failed, pigments ran out, markets changed. Still, they persisted. The act of shaping clay, of painting the same motifs again and again, had its own rhythm, like breathing. It was not exciting work, but it was sustaining. It connected them to the earth beneath the canals, to the fire in their kiln, to the trade winds that carried their creations far beyond the flat horizon of their homeland. Sometimes, a potter might pause at his bench, brush in hand, and wonder whether the people across the sea, in England or Portugal, or perhaps even in China, would ever think of the hands that painted these blues. Would they imagine the soot on the rafters, the long hours, the quiet pride of those who made beauty that was never meant to shout? The potters did not know, but they continued, day after day, shaping the silence of their city into color and form. Delft became a world of small miracles, of clay that remembered the river, of pigment that remembered the mountain, of fire that remembered the sun. And beneath it all, one quiet question lingered, as faint as smoke rising from a cooling kiln. When imitation becomes its own art, does it still remember the thing it was meant to copy? If you could walk through Delft around the year 1670. You would hear the steady rhythm of a city that had found its craft. The air smelled faintly of coal and glaze, a scent that clung to the clothes of those who worked the kiln. Every street in the Pottery quarter hummed with a quiet industriousness, not loud, not hurried, just constant. The kind of persistence that made time feel circular, not linear. At the edges of the city, barges drifted along the canals, their decks stacked with crates of earthenware bound for Rotterdam or Amsterdam. Inside each crate, straw cushioned the cool blue surfaces of Delftware. Every plate and tile bore tiny traces of its maker, a brushstroke thicker here, a small run of glaze, their little signs of humanity, hidden within the geometry of blue borders and floral curls. The Dutch Republic was at its height. Ships sailed under the orange, white, and blue flag to every coast of the known world. Sugar came from Brazil, spices from the Indies, silk from the East, and among those goods, often overlooked, were the ceramics of Delft. They were light compared to bricks or barrels, easy to pack and ship, and endlessly desirable to the growing merchant class of Europe. But the beauty of Delftware was more than decoration, it was identity. To the Dutch, it symbolized precision, control, and quiet prosperity. In a country that wrestled daily with the sea, the calm order of blue on white patterns offered a kind of reassurance. Inside the workshops, that calm was hard-earned. The painters' benches were long, their surfaces stained with cobalt and charcoal. Around them, the apprentices worked in near silence, grinding pigments, cleaning brushes, trimming clay edges. The masters moved slowly between them, inspecting the work with an eye for balance, the thickness of a border, the placement of a flower. The designs themselves had changed subtly over time. Early Delftware copied Chinese scenes, pagodas, willows, and cloud bands. But gradually, local motifs began to appear. Dutch ships instead of Chinese junks, windmills in place of temples, tulips and peonies intertwined. What began as imitation was quietly becoming something of its own, a fusion of East and West, filtered through Dutch restraint. Patterns were transferred using stencils cut from parchment or copper sheets. The painter would hold the stencil against the glazed surface and brush along its edge, leaving faint outlines to fill in. This method saved time and ensured consistency, a necessity for mass production. Yet even then, each artist left something distinct, a softer curve, a slightly different hue. No two pieces were ever truly the same. It was in this world that Delft's greatest potteries rose, de porcelein fles, de Grieksche, a het jonge Morianschuft. Their names, the porcelain bottle, the Greek ape, the young Moor's head, sounded more like taverns than factories, and in some ways they were warm, smoky, and full of chatter about prices, clay, and fire. Each workshop was both a business and a family, where generations learned to throw paint and fire to the craftsmen. Porcelain from China remained a mystery. They knew it was made from a white clay called kaolin, but they could not yet reproduce it. For decades, European alchemists tried to unlock its secret, mixing minerals, burning them, grinding them, and starting again. Delftware, in the meantime, filled the gap. Not porcelain, but something else, something sturdier and perhaps more honest. A Delft plate, when you held it, was heavier than porcelain. The glaze was thicker, its blue less sharp, more clouded. But in those soft hues lay its charm. The color did not shout, it whispered. It evoked fog over canals, sea light on a winter morning, and the faint echo of bells through damp air. It was a palette of a nation accustomed to gray skies. Finding beauty in restraint, some potters began experimenting with new shapes, apothecary jars, tile panels for fireplaces, and even entire walls decorated with blue and white scenes. Delftware tiles, small, square, and endlessly repeatable, became a feature of Dutch interiors. Kitchens and halls glimmered with tiny painted worlds, windmills, cows, ships, children playing with hoops. One can imagine a Delft painter at dusk finishing a batch of such tiles. The light would fade, and he'd lean closer to see the wet cobalt lines darken against the milky glaze. Outside, the city would quiet, save for the creak of a passing barge and the occasional toll of a church bell. In that stillness, perhaps he thought of the long journey his work would take, from his small room to some distant parlor in London or Lisbon. Trade networks made even small artisans part of a global web. Delft Blue, though born of imitation, became an ambassador of Dutch taste. The irony was not lost on anyone. The very porcelain they had once copied was now being replaced in European homes by its imitation. Wealthy merchants filled their dining rooms with Delft vases, their mantels with Delft tiles. It became a mark of quiet sophistication, art that was both domestic and exotic, humble yet worldly. But even as Delftware spread across Europe, challenges crept closer. Other towns began to imitate Delft's style: Haarlem, Rotterdam, even London. By the 1680s, factories in England were producing their own tin-glazed pottery, often cheaper and faster. Delft's potters, bound by guild rules and tradition, found it difficult to adapt. The same patience that made their work beautiful also made it slow. Still, for a time, Delft held its ground. The guild enforced quality marks, tiny initials or symbols impressed into the clay before firing. These marks told the story of who made what and when. They were not signatures of pride, but of accountability, ensuring that every potter stood behind his work. For those within the guild, the rhythm of the year was measured not in seasons, but in firings. Spring for gathering clay, summer for drying and painting, autumn for firing, winter for shipping. The cycle repeated endlessly, year after year. Even as the Republic changed, wars came and went, and the canals froze or thawed. The kilns of Delft continued to glow, steady and red. Beneath their soot-darkened roofs, there was something deeply human in that persistence, a kind of faith in repetition. The potters might not have thought of themselves as artists, but they carried an unspoken philosophy that beauty could emerge not from invention, but from careful attention to what already exists. And yet, one question began to murmur through the workshops, carried in whispers between masters and apprentices. As new materials arrived from abroad, whiter clays, better glazes, stronger kilns, they wondered, if perfection ever came, would there still be a place for the imperfect beauty of Delft Blue? By the early 18th century, the light over Delft had changed. The canals still reflected the same gray sky. The windmills still turned slowly on the horizon, but something quieter had begun to fade beneath the surface, the long hum of the potter's wheels. The smoke that once rose day and night from the kilns in the workshops many benches stood empty. Apprentices left for other trades, shipbuilding, carpentry, the growing industries of the Republic. The potters who remained still shaped their clay with practiced hands, but their customers were fewer. The reason lay far away in the hills of Saxony, where European alchemists had at last discovered the secret of true porcelain. In 1708, a German chemist named Johann Friedrich Bedtime, imprisoned by a king who hoped he could make gold, found something else instead, the formula for the pure white clay known as kaolin. Within a few years, the first European porcelain factory opened in Meissen, near Dresden. Its wares were lighter, stronger, and finer than anything Delft could produce. The discovery spread quickly. Vienna, Severs, and later England's Staffordshire all learned to make porcelain. Delft's proud imitations now found themselves imitated and surpassed. Still, in the quiet rooms of Delft, some continued to work. Their brushes traced the same familiar motifs: windmills, ships, floral borders. The blue remained beautiful, but its market was shrinking. The merchants of Amsterdam wanted Meissen's gloss, not Delft's softness. The wealthy wanted perfection, not patience. And yet, there were those who stayed, old masters, who could not imagine life without the smell of glaze or the weight of clay in their hands. They worked more slowly now, not for export, but for pride, for continuity. Each firing felt like an act of defiance against the passing of time. Inside the workshop of de Porcelain Fles, one of the last great potteries, the routine continued with almost monastic devotion. Apprentices rose early to stoke the kilns. Painters bent over their benches in the cool morning light, tracing the same gentle curves they had learned from their fathers in those final generations of the craft's golden age. Delft Blue took on a new meaning, no longer a symbol of national pride or global trade. It became a quiet art of remembrance, a dialogue between the earth and the hands that shaped it. Collectors came, sometimes from far away. They walked through the dusty storerooms, picking up plates that bore faint chips, hairline cracks, or faded cobalt. They admired not the perfection, but the endurance. Delftware, they said, carried the atmosphere of another age, a time when beauty moved at the pace of human labor. And perhaps that is what has kept Delft Blue alive, even as fashions changed from Rococo curls to industrial iron, from romantic paintings to electric light. Something in those calm blue patterns continued to speak. They are not dramatic, not loud, but when you look at them, you can almost feel the steadiness of the hand that made them. The clay, after all, came from rivers that never stopped flowing. The cobalt, ground to powder, came from mountains that still stand. And the fire, the same fire that once melted bronze in Benin, or fused glass in Murano, still burns wherever people shape the earth into memory today. Delft's pottery tradition survives in small workshops, often quieter than ever. Tourists watch as artisans paint the same designs once carried on ships across oceans. The brushes are finer now, the kilns cleaner, but the rhythm is unchanged. Each line of blue repeats a story told 1,000 times before, of imitation, transformation, and persistence. And if you hold a piece of Delftware in your hand, you can still see faint traces of its making. Beneath the glaze, a fingerprint. Along the rim, a ripple where the brush hesitated. These imperfections are not flaws. They are signatures of a craft that was never about speed or perfection, but about the endurance of care. In the end, Delft Blue did not vanish. It simply became what it had always been, a reflection of the world around it, calm, cloudy, resilient. It is the color of waiting, the color of patience, the color of the North Sea, seen from a window when the rain refuses to end. And perhaps that is its greatest beauty, because Delft Blue reminds us that history, like glaze, settles slowly. It hardens, not in the flames of greatness, but in the steady, unseen labor of those who keep repeating the same gesture, day after day, until the ordinary becomes something quietly eternal. The potters of Delft never set out to create an icon. They only sought to make a living, to shape what their hands could hold. Yet what they left behind still gleams, centuries later, with the faint light of their devotion. And as the evening deepens, and the last kiln cools beneath a soft Dutch sky, one can imagine a potter pausing by the canal, watching his reflection tremble in the water, blue upon blue. And so the kilns of Delft cool at last. The blue and white vessels, shaped by careful hands, rest quietly on shelves and tables, their stories held in every brushstroke. Every ripple of glaze. The potters are gone now, their fires faded, but the calm persistence of their work remains a quiet echo of centuries, reminding us that patience and care can outlast empires. Perhaps in your own life there is a small act, repeated day after day, that leaves a trace as enduring as blue on white clay. As you drift toward sleep, imagine those hands shaping earth, the smell of glaze in the air, and the slow, steady glow of a kiln that never hurried, never shouted, yet carried beauty across oceans and time. And now, let the quiet of Delft and the patience of its makers carry you softly into rest. Good night.